Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, everybody, to Woke with Wudu. I decided, forget everything that I've been doing, just looking at random videos that were piquing my interest at the moment. I want to go through the current conflicts of the world, and I want to go through them from the first one to the last one. And the three main ones that exist right now that I want to discuss, and we'll do one like each day, is you got Russia and Ukraine. That's one. You got China. That's not really a full blown conflict right now in terms of actual war happening, but it is something that is consistently talked about. It is something that I heard from like 2 3 years ago, that prepare for war with China by like 2026 2027. So we'll discuss that one. And then the last, of course, is Israel and its bordering countries and regional countries that it decides to attack. So we'll cover each one. For today, I want to get into the Russia-Ukraine war, and I thought what better place to start than with Mr. John Mearsheimer and the debate that he had in 2022 in Norway. This is pretty lengthy. We'll see if we get through it all. We'll probably have to do a few different videos on this, a few different streams to get through it all. But let's get started here. Before we watch the video and react to it live, let me tell you some information about John Mearsheimer, because how I view the world, I've seen other people, political scientists and theorists, and how they view it through whatever theory they believe. John Mearsheimer, to me, is the one that's actually most realistic. And that's ironic because he describes himself essentially as a proponent of offensive realism. That is like the structural theory that he believes in. It's called realism, which is wild. Like, how does that? Aren't we all supposed to be talking about what's real? I don't even know how that's the name of it. But let's give some background on him. So, Mearsheimer is the leading proponent of offensive realism. This structural theory, unlike the classical realism, places the principal emphasis on security competition among great powers within the anarchy of the international system, not on the human nature of statesmen and diplomats. In contrast to another structural theory, realist theory, the defensive realism, offensive realism maintains that states are not satisfied with a given amount of power but seek hegemony for security because the anarchic makeup of the international system creates strong incentives for states to seek opportunities to gain power at the expense of competitors. So, you know, a country is not just about the statesmen and diplomats and what they want to do, essentially. There's a deeper state that is trying to get more power within the international system. And then, furthermore, um, it is not about just being satisfied with what you have, but it is about continuously trying to get more and more power. I believe that's the reality of the world. I think every state is trying to do that, or not. Or let's rephrase that a little bit. I don't know about every single state, but the larger, more powerful states, I think, are definitely doing that. And the three that you can think of, the U.S., Russia, and China, those are the main three, and they're all vying for power in their regions and across the world in generality. Mearsheimer dismisses democratic peace theory, which claims that democracies never or rarely go to war with each other. He also does not believe it to be possible for a state to become a global hegemon. Although that is theoretically possible, there is too much landmass and too many oceans, which he posits as having effective stopping power and acting as giant moats. Instead, he believes that states can achieve only regional hegemony. Furthermore, he argues that regional hegemons attempt to prevent other states from gaining hegemony in their region, since peer competitors would be free to roam and thus could interfere in the established regional hegemon's neighborhood. Yes, I have to agree. In history, there have been, you could argue that there have been global hegemonies, the U.S. being one, although, the USSR and the U.S., you could say, are also make the argument were regional hegemons, but there was a period of time where the U.S. was the global hegemon. We're no longer there. I would argue that there's three right now, with it being one, the U.S., 2 China, and 3 Russia in that order of power. And he argues here, states that have achieved regional hegemony, such as the US, will act as offshore balancers by interfering in other regions if the great powers in those regions cannot prevent the rise of a hegemon. Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism has become a popular explanation of the American strategic approach in resisting China as a growing superpower that might one day unseat America's dominant position. I agree in totality with John Mearsheimer on a lot of things. I think he's the most realistic, ironically. Again, that wording is absurd. He's the most like actual, factually, objective-based political scientist out there. And his views, I think, are what's the reality is. Others, I think, are way off base. And we'll see that in this debate here. So let's get started. And the Monroe Doctrine, if people don't know what that is a crazy thing. The Monroe Doctrine is a United States foreign policy position that opposes European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere, holds that any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas by foreign powers is a potentially hostile act against the U.S. Essentially, it doesn't allow anybody that's not in the region to get involved in the region. And when we're talking about the region, we're talking about the Americas, North America and South America. Like the Western Hemisphere of the world cannot be touched by the Eastern Hemisphere. That's the Monroe Doctrine, essentially. At the same time, the U.S. gets involved everywhere else, though. It's hypocrisy 101, but that's because the U.S. is the #1 power in the world. That's again following exactly what John Mearsheimer says. Like, a country's never happy. A hegemon is never happy with their power, with what they hold. They always are going to continue to try and gain more and more power, and they're going to stop other countries from becoming regional hegemons, which is exactly what the U.S. is doing by getting involved in the world in the ways that it does. So again, that's a little bit about John Mearsheimer and a little bit about offensive realism. Let's get into this debate. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes long. Probably going to have to break this up into multiple videos for the YouTube audience out there, but let's get started here. We're going to get some introductory details here from some of the people there, and then they're going to give pretty much each of the 2 debaters some time to bring about their theories and their analysis of the world, and then from there on it's going to be like a Q&A session.
You go first. It is my profound pleasure to welcome you, the audience here in the University Aula in Bergen, Norway, as well as viewers around the world, to this year's Holberg Debate. My name is Kjersti Fløttum, and I'm the chair of the Holberg Board. The Holberg Prize is one of the largest international prizes awarded to outstanding scholars within the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. The prize was established by the Norwegian government in 2003 in homage to the scientist and writer Ludvig Holberg, who lived from 1684 to 1754. In addition to the academic events that are held each year in celebration of the Holberg Prize laureate, the Holberg Debate is held annually in December in tribute to Ludvig Holberg's Enlightenment ideals. The debate aims to engage prominent academics as well as non-academics in public debate on pressing issues in our time. And the topic of this year's debate is the current global security crisis facing us. In particular, we will focus on Ukraine, Russia, China, and the West, and what kind of power and deterrence that may prevent future wars or escalation of existing conflicts. We have called the debate by the question, will fear keep us safe? On the panel, we are pleased to have Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and former Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Carl Bildt. We are also very pleased to have with us Dr. Cecilia Hellestvedt, who will moderate the event. Hellestveit is a conflict researcher at the Norwegian Academy of International Law, Folkerettsinstituttet in Norwegian. She has a PhD in international humanitarian law from the University of Oslo, and she has been associated with a number of research institutes, both in Norway and abroad. So, without further ado, I hereby give the floor to Cecilie Hellestveit.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Kjersti. Dear audience, I'm honored and delighted to have the privilege to moderate the Holberg Debate of 2022, organized by the Holberg Prize, in the loveliest of cities in Norway, Bergen. But while the city is bright and cheerful, the subject of tonight's debate is far from it. It is dark and gloomy, because we live in dangerous times. This year, war on land between nations returned to continental Europe. Russia's aggressive military assault on Ukraine is a watershed, a monumental event in the history of modern Europe. And we are still struggling to gauge all the effects that this war of aggression will have for the future of Europe and the world at large. Simultaneously, other dark clouds are on the horizon. The rivalry in technological, political, economic, and military terms between the giants of the world, the US and China, is gaining traction. But even when war and geopolitical rivalry is upon us, and it is very clear to us who is a friend and who is a foe, public debate must take place. And the Holberg Debate this year ventures into this complex and sensitive landscape, asking whether fear will keep us safe, and what do the current geopolitical crisis mean for the power of deterrence and the prospects of a new global security order. As the journalist and grand strategist Walter Lippmann once observed, where all think alike, no one thinks very much. On behalf of the Holberg Prize, I'm therefore delighted to present to the public two distinguished speakers who do not think alike. One is a scholar of politics, and one is a craftsman of politics. One is American, and one is European. One is a proponent of the school of realism, the other a firm believer in liberal traditions. Our two speakers have expressed views in stark contrast to each other, notably on Russia and her war on Ukraine. The American guest is, and realist scholar is John Mearsheimer. Professor John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He graduated from West Point in 1970 and served 5 years in the US Air Force. Mearsheimer has also been a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and Council of Foreign Relations in New York. The European politician is Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden. Carl Bildt has also a distinguished international career. Among others, he was the EU Special Envoy to the former Yugoslavia, High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and UN Special Envoy to the Balkans. He also was a co-chair of the Dayton Peace Conference. Bildt is currently co-chair of the European Council of Foreign Relations. And we will start the debate by hearing opening remarks from both speakers. And I do want to remind the audience that, and the viewers, that they still have the opportunity to send in questions for the speakers. And since we are in Europe, and this is Carl Bildt's turf, we first give the floor to him. The floor is yours, Carl.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction, and it's truly a pleasure to be here in Bergen. I've come not too long. Professor Mearsheimer had come a long way, but I think we both look forward to this particular debate. And let's be clear, we have entered more dangerous times. That certainly applies to the global order, or perhaps the lack thereof. But it applies, of course, in particular to the situation that we are faced with in this part of the world, in our Europe. In the American debate, the focus has always been, or has often been, on the risk of an armed confrontation with a rising China, notably over the future status of Taiwan, and that has loomed large. And policies have been oriented and are oriented towards trying to contain that and slow down the rise of Chinese power in different domains. But here in our Europe, we are since 10 months in the largest military conflict this part of the world has seen since 1945, with no end in sight and with consequences that will last decades. We did, after all, manage to secure some sort of peace during the long decades of the Cold War. In half of Europe, it was the peace of the graveyard. We were in the lucky part. And perhaps the recognition that war in Europe in those days could have led and could have taken us all into nuclear Armageddon played an important part.
Just two things I wanted to note real quick. This debate, at least it was published here in December 2022. Can't fully tell here, but published December 1st, 2022 on YouTube. Not sure when it actually took place. So, as we know, Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. So, you're talking about almost 10 months, 9 months, something like that, after the invasion. So, that was, prime time, the prime time issue at the time, the prime time issue in the world during this debate. Secondly, this guy, he was part of the International Advisory Council of the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, which was a group that was pushing for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So this guy's historical policies and ideas were not always up to par. Just FYI on that as well. Okay.
In bringing stability during those long, dark decades. But then the Soviet Union and its wider empire, under the weight of its own failure, collapsed more than 3 decades ago. And the task for particular policy practitioners like myself since then has been to try to build an order that could not only secure peace and security, but hopefully also an element of freedom and prosperity for every part of our continent. And it is these efforts that are now under such a mortal threat from the military aggression initiated by Vladimir Putin 10 months ago. Europe hasn't seen anything since when Adolf Hitler in September 1939 launched his all-out attack against Poland. And there are important similarities between the two cases. In both cases, it was war started by a personal decision of a dictator that didn't really feel any constraints whatsoever. In both cases, it was war started by dictators driven by some sort of vision derived of history of what they wanted to achieve. Hitler wanted to get rid of independent Poland. It was an unnecessary creation of the Versailles Peace Treaty. Putin wants to get rid of Ukraine as an independent entity. He describes this as an unnecessary mistake and creation by, of all people, Vladimir Lenin. Hitler, of course, then continued. When he attacked and occupied Norway, it was described as absolutely necessary to safeguard the security interests of his greater Germany. We know how it all ended. But we don't know how this horrible war will end.
See, this is where I'm totally not following this guy. He's making a comparison between Putin and Hitler. I don't think they're nearly the same type of character that this guy is trying to allude to, and that they're looking to invade the world, essentially. If Russia was trying to invade countries and literally take them over fully, first of all, you have countries, many countries in Europe that are within NATO. So those countries that are out of the picture, because that would start World War III. So it makes no sense to me, all this talk about Russia trying to expand. If it's going to attack other countries that aren't in NATO, like Ukraine, for example, and some of the bordering countries above Ukraine, then you have more of a stance there. But even then, like, there's been peace for quite some time between Russia and those countries. Why would it randomly start jumping in now? Doesn't make much sense to me. And at the same time, if Russia was going to try to invade, the US would jump in as a hegemon of the world and try to just make Russia use more troops, more ammunition, more weapons, and deteriorate Russia through the proxy of that country. So they would help that country militarily in terms of weapons and whatnot, which is exactly what's happening in Ukraine.
It's indeed horrible. We have several hundreds of thousands of soldiers engaged in combat. We have more than 1,000, as a matter of fact, 1,300 kilometers of front line. We have waves after waves of missiles against the civilian infrastructure of the entire Ukrainian nation. We have the greatest number of people displaced or forced to flee of any conflict in any part of the world during the last few decades. The Ukrainians are determined to fight for their freedom. You can't really blame them. And they are more so determined with every new missile and every new bomb that strikes them. But Vladimir Putin is unlikely to back down from seeking to dismember, control, and subdue Ukraine. He has described it several times as a life and death struggle. In all probability, it is a life and death struggle for him. He is unlikely, in my opinion, or he is likely, in my opinion, to escalate as long as he can until he runs out of possibilities and until he collapses. But let's look at the principles if we are to search for new stability. There are two principles that I consider absolutely fundamental for the security of our continent. The first is obviously that aggression should never be tolerated. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials after the Second World War considered aggression to be the ultimate international crime. Every other war crime derives from the crime of aggression. And the second principle that I consider fundamental is that borders should be respected and should never be altered by force. Most of the borders of Europe have been drawn by blood during past centuries. Not all of them are entirely logical. Sometimes the past still creates emotions and tensions. But if you open up the issue of borders, if you allow one country to dismember another country, one country taking one big, taking over parts of a smaller, you will open up a Pandora's box of true horrors for all of Europe. These are not only principles of international law, but they are primarily, I would argue, principles derived from the very bitter history of Europe. But they are, of course, also principles that resonate strongly across the world. Faced with the Russian aggression, in two landmark decisions, the UN General Assembly, with first 141 and then 144 votes in favor, endorsed these principles. Only 5, I would classify them as outcast nations, voted against. So when we support Ukraine today, it is not only supporting the right of its freedom and independence, but also the support for upholding these principles that are fundamental to the security of all of our European nations.
He kind of he did two things there. He's talking about principles, and ironically, he ends it with upholding just the principles and the security of the European nations. He says that because that's the threat that he's saying Russia is targeting, is that to come for the European countries. But it's ironic at the same time because weren't you part of the group that tried to invade Iraq in 2003? Where was the movement to stop that? You know, weren't you? You're now saying borders should be secure, borders should be sovereign, borders should be respected, but at the same time, in 2003, no, you know, we didn't know that back then. So this is why I don't like these types of people, because I don't think he's actually talking about reality-based principles, because he doesn't follow those principles himself. It's being hypocritical. The US and NATO don't follow these principles. They will go into countries whenever they want, and then they will use those principles against countries who do exactly what they're doing. Makes no, there's really no principles. They're just used as propaganda.
Aggression must never be tolerated. Borders must be respected. Hitler, as you might remember, had all sorts of arguments for invading Poland. He considered it much too close, in alliance, as a matter of fact, with Britain and France. He didn't like its treatment of the German minorities. He considered the entire Versailles settlement, Polish corridor and all of that unfair to Germany. And Putin also marshals argument against Ukraine. He doesn't like them, to put it mildly, wanting deeper integration with the European Union and indeed NATO. He bitterly regrets and opposes the departure of former President Yanukovych. He certainly don't like his talk about colored revolutions and democracy. He thinks Russia has been mistreated by the Americans. But nothing of this, be it right or be it wrong, gave neither Hitler nor Putin any sort whatsoever the right to invade Poland or invade Ukraine. And let's be clear, true peace in Europe can't be restored until this aggression has been rolled back and Ukraine has been secured.
Again, like he keeps up with this like Hitler, Putin talk, which I think is horrible. Like I don't think anybody's actually believing this type of thing, but that's the theme that he wants to go with. And then again, he is talking about borders and respecting borders and stopping aggressors. It's so hypocritical from everything that these people do, and these people being the Western countries, essentially, led by the US, coming into the Middle East. How many times? Iraq 2003 being the prime example. For no reason. There was no reason for them to enter Iraq at all. There was nothing. They were talking about weapons of mass destruction. First of all, you guys have weapons of mass destruction yourselves. Secondly, there were no weapons of mass destruction. You all knew that. The intelligence at the time told you that. But nonetheless, you went in there and just used weapons of mass destruction as an excuse. So again, all this principle talk is all utter nonsense because they don't follow it in reality. They just use that talk as posturing themselves as the right people. Look, they're the ones doing the wrong. We're trying to defend these principles. They're giving themselves in public the posture of being the right guys, the right people, the right countries, in the right, but it's all nonsense.
As a democracy freely able to choose its own path for the future.
Another note is like, and you'll see with John Mearsheimer once he comes in with his realism opinion, this guy's saying like Russia has no right to invade Ukraine. In reality, in theory, we all agree with that, right? No country has the right to invade another country. But in the reality of the world, no matter what you're gonna do, and you can take this to as little of a example as a person living in an apartment, right? You cannot do anything you want in that complex, in that apartment. There are rules that you have to follow because everybody in that neighborhood, in that apartment complex, wants to be feeling safe and secure and living together peacefully. So there are rules that you have to respect, and those rules are set by the complex, which is essentially, you can think of it as like the organization of the region, and that's really in the world view set by like the main hegemon of the region. So in reality, as a country, you can't do anything you want to do. In theory, it sounds great and nice and amazing, like every country should do whatever it wants to do because it has the right to, and no country can invade another. But in reality, you have to watch out for your neighbors and take into any decision you're going to make. You have to remember that those decisions could have consequences on your neighboring countries. And if there are going to be negative consequences, you better be prepared for negative consequences from or repercussions from your neighboring countries as well. So especially, you have to take that even more into consideration when your neighboring countries are more powerful than you. So with Ukraine and Russia, that's the situation. Like Ukraine, you can't do everything that you want to do and not think about how it's going to affect your neighboring countries, especially the large power next to you, Russia. So you can't do anything that Russia's not going to like. That's just the reality of the world. We might not like it in theory, but that is the reality. And again, we do this on a day in, day out basis with our families, with our friends. We don't do anything that we want to do. We have to take into consideration how this stuff might impact our family, how these decisions impact our friends, our complex. I can't get a snake into my apartment if my apartment complex doesn't allow it, right? I can't do certain things because there are rules and regulations and considerations I have to think about. It's the same thing on a worldview from a country perspective.
And this can't be achieved until Russia has given up its imperial ambition and focused its energies on building a functioning nation state. As long as it is dragged away by an imperial temptation, it will never be able to develop in harmony, peace and security with the rest of Europe. And with 140 million people, 11 time zones, and vast natural resources, it doesn't really need an empire in order to be successful. We want to live in peace with a prosperous and stable Russia. I do believe that representative rule, constitutional order, and rule of law would be hugely beneficial for that country. But ultimately, that's up to them to decide. But Putin's aggression means that there's now a fundamental and indeed dangerous uncertainty as to the future of Russia. His war has already failed to reach its objective. But where is Russia some years from now? Will it be in internal chaos and conflict? Will it be on an even more militaristic regime? Or will there be Alexei Navalny competing in free and fair election? No one knows. But one thing we know, this war and its consequences will be with us for a long time. The entire order between the rivers Vistula and Volga is in flux. In our immediate part of the world, Finland and Sweden will soon enter NATO. Denmark has given up its reservation against security and defense dimensions of the European Union. NATO will further enhance its forward presence in the Baltic countries. There are 20,000 more US soldiers on European soil than just a year ago. All countries are increasing their defense expenditure. And NATO and the EU will move closer together, the one a military alliance, the other a security alliance. In my opinion, the future security of Europe will be a function of the security of Ukraine. A secure Ukraine will create the conditions for stability and peace in Europe, and also for Russia to be able to develop as a great nation state. A destroyed, a dismembered, a divided, and a distraught Ukraine will only generate chaos and conflict for years to come. Today, it's a brutal battle on the plains of the east of Europe. People in their hundreds, perhaps thousands, are dying on a weekly or daily basis. Sometime in the future, the days of diplomacy must certainly come, but we are clearly not there yet. But then, those days of diplomacy must be based on the fundamental principles I have mentioned. The peace and stability of Europe must be based on them. And the peace and stability of Europe is, of course, also should be a global concern.
Let me just stop him one more time here. Essentially, what he just said so far is that there can only be peace once Ukraine is safe and secure and Russia is no longer attacking it. The reason Russia is attacking it is because Ukraine wants to be in NATO. That was the whole issue. And NATO is just a military alliance of the Western countries led by the US. It's like a military arm of the US, essentially, like a proxy of the US, if you want to think about it that way. And they're trying to get Ukraine into NATO, which Ukraine is bordering Russia. Just imagine for a moment, because this is the issue that this is the thing nobody seems like in the world does. Put yourselves in Russia's perspective, right? Think about the US, if you're a US citizen or whatever, in the US, or whatever country you're in. Think for a moment, if you were in the US, or whatever country you're in, would you allow a military alliance to take your neighboring country and enter into that military alliance? And you are, by the way, an enemy of that military alliance. You're not really peaceful with them, and not really from your point of view, but from the other person's point of view, you are an enemy. So would you allow that to happen? Like we said in the introduction, the Monroe Doctrine exists. That is something the US has. It doesn't allow any country in the world to have a presence, essentially, and get involved on the Western Hemisphere. I'm not even talking about like getting into a neighboring country of the US like Canada or Mexico and building a military alliance with that country and having, imagine if Russia has missiles in Canada pointing at the US. You think the US will allow that? That was the thing that happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we almost went to war with Russia over. So the US doesn't allow that, and not only does it not allow it to its neighboring countries like Mexico, Canada, and you can go say Cuba, it doesn't even allow it in the Western Hemisphere at all. You're talking about half the world is US is saying, we control this half of the world, you better not have any weapons in this area or get involved in this area. On the other hand, they want to be able to allow Ukraine into NATO and have US soldiers sitting in Ukraine, NATO soldiers sitting in Ukraine, NATO military equipment sitting in Ukraine, pointed at Russia on their doorstep. It's hypocrisy 101. Makes no sense if you think about it. The US wouldn't allow it, nobody would allow it. But at the same time, nobody seems to think about this perspective, which is crazy to me, because it's what you should always be doing in any situation, is putting yourself in the other person's shoes and thinking, always looking at both sides and thinking through their lens, through their eyes. Is that objectively fair? Is that fine? When the US wants it but doesn't allow it itself, you should know that it's probably not a good thing. You probably shouldn't be on their side in that instance.
Twice in the last century, Strife and conflict in Europe brought war to all of the globe. And there are, as I'm sure we'll debate, numerous other issues as well. There is more global disorder than order. The rivalry between the US and China must be handled. Responsible competition is the slogan, the catchphrase that is used in Washington today. And I hope the same phrase can be used in Beijing as well. The power balance is indeed shifting. China will be the largest economy in the world, with growing naval and now also nuclear capabilities. And both nations are in a desperate race to control the technologies of the future. They know that that is where power ultimately lies. Europe, having to handle the brutal war, sits in between these competing global powers. It does consist of nations that are small and some that don't yet understand that they are small. And we are the European Union. We are a civil, a trading, an economic, and in increasing respects also a security power. In a way, you can say that the European Union is a hybrid power, able to handle hybrid threats. But it is certainly not a military power. It can, most particularly, only handle the nuclear might of Russia through its alliance with the United States. Nuclear deterrence remains an unavoidable, perhaps somewhat unpleasant, but unavoidable foundation of our security. And the overall security agenda as we look ahead is indeed both dense and tense, preventing nuclear proliferation and war, containing the unavoidable disorders of the greater Middle East, facilitating all of the consequences of the rapid demographic rise of Africa, handling the security implications of climate change, notably in the Arctic, not too far from here, securing a safe entry into the digital age of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. It's a tall order, perhaps taller than any political generation has faced for quite a long time. But for us, in this part of the world, here in our Europe, securing the future of Ukraine is the foundation for everything else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl, for providing us with a very fruitful basis for a discussion. And then, Professor Mearsheimer, I'm happy to give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I feel honored to be asked to be here this evening. Let me start by saying that I agree completely with both what Cecilia said and what Carl said about the fact we live in a very dangerous world today. I'd put a finer point on it and say that I think the world is likely to get more dangerous with the passage of time. And number two, I believe that the world that we are moving into is more dangerous than the Cold War was. And of course, the Cold War was dangerous, but there's bigger trouble ahead. Now, the question is, why do I say that? I say that because...
Just one thing here again, remember this was at the end of 2022. 8, 9, 10 months after Russia invaded Ukraine. We're now in 2025. What he's saying right now is that the world's going to get more dangerous. Think about what happened from 2022 till now, from the moment he made those statements till now. Look at the world now. You got Israel attacking all sorts of countries, including Iran, the US getting involved with Iran. You had the Pakistan, India. You have Thailand, Cambodia. The growing talk about China and Taiwan. He's on point. He's on point, and it's going to continue to get worse.
You have to think about what the world looked like when World War II ended and how it's evolved over time. And you have to think about how the structure of the world has changed, because that tells you a great deal about the likelihood of conflict. When I was born in 1947, it was a bipolar world. There were two great powers in the system, the United States and the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended in 1989, and certainly when the Soviet Union fell apart in December of 1991, we moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world. Then around 2017, the structure of the system began to change, and we moved from unipolarity to multipolarity, a world where there are three great powers, the United States, China, and Russia. So if you think about it, in my lifetime, we went from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity. Now, what this means is that in the multipolar world we're in now, we have what I would call two conflict dyads involving great powers. One is the US-China dyad, and the other is the US-Russia dyad. During the unipolar moment, you had no great power competition. Most of you young people in the audience were born in the unipolar moment. There was only one great power in the system in the unipolar moment, and you cannot have great power competition by definition when you have only one great power. In the bipolar world that I was born into, there were two great powers, and you had one conflict dyad, the United States and the Soviet Union. So what you see is today you have a major conflict dyad in Asia involving China and the United States, a major conflict dyad involving great powers here in Europe involving the United States and Russia. That's two conflict dyads versus one in the Cold War and none in the unipolar moment. Furthermore, war is more likely. Security competition is more likely to turn into war in the US-China competition and in the US-Russia competition than it was during the Cold War. So what I'm saying to you is that we have more potential wars between great powers in the multipolar world we now live in, right? And furthermore, those wars are more likely. Now, why do I say that? I think what I have to do here is explain to you how I think about the security competition between the United States and China in East Asia. Just tell you what I think is going on there.
Just to cut him off real quick, and you can just think about this statistically, numerically, right? Before you had no competition between great powers, then you had one, now you have two. Simply put, you have a greater number, so there's greater risk. At the same time, why is there a greater risk, not just from that 0, 1, 2 number, but literally it's because with the greater number of powers, these powers are now going to compete against each other across the world in a variety of things, economically, strategically, geopolitically, whatever you want to call it, through a variety of countries, through a variety of means. In all these little instances of competition, you have more competition, which leads to greater risk of war. There could be a lot of things now that the US and China could be competing over, and China could be doing things, manipulating things, whatever, that the US doesn't like, and it just inflames. There's more room for an inflammation of issues because there are greater powers, so there's more competition.
And then talk about what's going on here in Europe in terms of the US-Russia competition. And of course, when I talk about the US-China competition, what I'm going to do is focus mainly on Taiwan. And when I focus on the US-Russia competition here in Europe, I'll focus mainly on Ukraine. And what I'm going to try and do is convince you that these are really dangerous situations. Now, with regard to US-China competition. What's happening here is that China is a peer competitor of the United States. If you were to rank order the three great powers in the system now, the United States remains the most powerful state on the planet. China is a close second, and there's great fear in the United States that they will eventually overtake us. And Russia is a distant third. Russia is a weak great power. There are a number of people who argue it shouldn't even be considered a great power. People should argue that we're in a bipolar world today that involves just the US and China. I don't agree with that. I think Russia is a great power, but it's the weakest of the three great powers. China's a potential hegemon. It's a potential hegemon in Asia. China is growing very powerful. And in international politics, when you grow very powerful, the ideal situation is to dominate your region of the world. It's to be a regional hegemon and to make sure that no other country on the planet, really no other great power on the planet, dominates its region of the world the way you dominate yours. And of course, the paradigmatic example of this is the United States of America. We are the only regional hegemon in the world. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. No American goes to bed at night worrying about any other country in the Western Hemisphere attacking us. Why? Because we are Godzilla. In the international system, you want to be Godzilla, and you want to make sure you're the only Godzilla on the planet. Well, the Chinese have figured this out. The Chinese want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese know full well what happens to you in international politics when you're weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. It runs from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. They were weak, and when they were weak, they were taken advantage of. You can rest assured that they want to make sure that they are by far the most powerful state in Asia, and you can rest assured that they'd like to get the Americans out beyond the first island chain, out beyond the second island chain, and far away from China. It's the best way to survive in international politics, to be a regional hegemon. And the Chinese are taking all that economic might they have and they're turning it into military might. Now, how are the Americans reacting to this? It's very clear. The Americans do not tolerate other regional hegemons in the system. The 20th century shows this very clearly. The United States played a key role in putting Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union on the scrap heap of history. We had no intention of letting any of those four countries dominate either Europe or Asia. You can rest assured, we have no intention of allowing China to dominate Asia. And in fact, we're not going to pursue a pure containment strategy. We're going to pursue a rollback strategy as well. We're going to try and weaken China the way we weakened the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We have our gun sights on the Chinese. The Chinese, of course, fully understand that, and they're going to great lengths to try to deal with us. And at the same time, as I said to you, the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in achieving regional hegemony. And the more powerful they grow economically, the better off they'll be at developing the military capability to achieve regional hegemony. This is why, of course, the United States is trying to slow down Chinese economic growth. So what you have in East Asia is an intense security competition between China and the United States. And the principal focus is on Taiwan. And Taiwan is a really dangerous situation. There is no analogous situation in the Cold War. The 1947 to 1989 Cold War. Berlin was not the equivalent of Taiwan. Why is Taiwan so dangerous? Taiwan is remarkably dangerous because, number one, the Chinese consider it sacred territory and they desperately want it back. Number two, the Americans believe firmly that for a variety of reasons, it's important that we not let China take Taiwan because it has great strategic value for us. So what's happening here is that the United States is now moving closer and closer to Taiwan. The Nancy Pelosi visit's just one indicator of how we're moving closer and closer to Taiwan. And this, of course, enrages the Chinese, because this is sacred territory. This is nationalism at play. The Americans are preventing us from getting Taiwan back. So you have a lot of tension. And then the third reason is, it's easy to imagine a Cold War in East Asia turning into a hot war over Taiwan, because it would be a battle over an island in a huge body of water. During the Cold War, when Carl and I were young, it was hard to imagine starting a war in Central Europe, because you had two massive armies with thousands of nuclear weapons in their inventory. And if those massive armies crashed into each other with all those nuclear weapons, we probably would have all gotten incinerated. So when we ran war games during the Cold War, it was very hard to get a war going in Europe, because everybody understood what the consequences would be. It's much easier to imagine a war breaking out over Taiwan. It's a small island out in the middle of a large body of water. And by the way, the other 2 points of friction in East Asia are the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And you can imagine a war breaking out over those 2 bodies of water. So you see the different scenarios between the Cold War, Central Europe, and the new Cold War in East Asia between China and the United States over Taiwan, or the South China Sea, or the East China Sea. So there's big trouble coming in East Asia. I'm not arguing here that war is inevitable, but it is going to be very difficult to avoid that intense security competition turning into a real war. Okay, let's shift gears and go to Europe and talk about what's going on in Ukraine. And here we're focusing mainly on the US-Russian dyad. And it's very important to understand that the Americans drive the train in the West. Putin doesn't want to talk to the Europeans. He wants to talk to the Americans. He knows who the boss is. Right? So when you think about the war in the Ukraine, it's really the US and the Russians that matter the most, in addition to the Ukrainians, of course. Now, the conventional wisdom in the West is that what is happening here is that Putin is an imperialist, and he is bent on creating a greater Russia, or recreating the Soviet Union. And what he is intent on doing in Ukraine is conquering that country, occupying that country, and integrating it into a greater Russia. And in fact, Ukraine is the first stop on the train line. When he's done with Ukraine, he's going to move on to other states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Poland, who knows. But he is an imperialist at heart. He's an aggressor who's interested in building an empire. This is the conventional wisdom that you all know well. I would imagine that most of you believe this. My view is this is simply wrong. There's no evidence to support it. I believe that if you're going to make that argument, you have to show evidence that Putin said it was desirable to conquer Ukraine and create a greater Russia. You have to show evidence that he thought it was feasible to do that. And you have to show evidence that he said that that's what he was doing. There is no evidence, and I want to underline that word, no. There is no evidence that he thought it was desirable to conquer Ukraine, or to create a greater Russia, or to conquer any other country. There's no evidence that he thought it was feasible. And there's no evidence that he said that's what he was doing. Furthermore, he does not have the capability to do it. The Russians invaded Ukraine with 190,000 men. There's no way 190,000 men could conquer a piece of real estate with 40+ million people in it with 190,000 men. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, they went in with 1.5 million men. You need a huge army to conquer a country like Ukraine, occupy it, and incorporate it into your country. And you're not going to do that with 190,000 men.
Bingo. See, essentially, they're just literally lying. They're literally lying. You're not going to be, I mean, just think about this. Just think about this, guys. Forget about Russia trying to expand and attack NATO countries. Let's just think about the idea if Russia really wants to expand and attack non-NATO countries that are bordering it, like Ukraine and others. It's going to have to put a huge force forward just to take over the country. It's going to get into a huge war. It knows the US and NATO are going to supply that country's troops and military. So it's not something that's going to be a quick win or a quick decisive victory. It's going to be a long, prolonged war. And it's going to deteriorate Russia's forces, kill many, many, many thousands, if not tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of its troops, and then deteriorate and reduce its military weaponry, just get rid of so many missiles, so many tanks, so many etc. that it could otherwise have supplied and ready. And at the same time, let's just say it wins the war. It's going to then have to incorporate that country into its own country. All those people are not going to be happy about being as part of Russia. It's always going to be essentially a security risk continuously, whether it was already before or it gets incorporated after losing the war. It's always going to remain a security risk, and it's a hot spot that the US and NATO could take advantage of and try to create like a rise there, create a fight against a revolution, so to speak. Like, just it's always a hot pocket in the country then. So it's not like a long-term strategy goal. It's not a good security risk aversion like strategy. The best thing they can do is take out the military and then incorporate it, but it's still going to be a security risk in the long game. That population is not going to be happy under Russia if they initially didn't want to go in there. So it makes no sense when they're trying to argue this fact, really, or sorry, when they're trying to argue this opinion of theirs that Russia is just out seeking to become a larger mass of land. Like, it's already huge. Well, he doesn't need more land, more mass. Doesn't make any sense. I would argue that there's something more there for why Russia is attacking Ukraine, and John Mearsheimer is going to get into that shortly.
Furthermore, this man, Vladimir Putin, does not have the Wehrmacht at his fingertips. You've noticed how poorly the Russian army performs. So you have a small army that's not the Wehrmacht. There's no way this army could conquer all of Ukraine. And if you look at the strategy that's been employed, my argument makes perfect sense. This is not a case of Putin acting like an imperialist. My argument is, as I'm sure many of you know, that if you look carefully at what was going on, it's quite clear that the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's borders was viewed as an existential threat. The brightest of all red lines, as Bill Burns, the US ambassador to Moscow at the time, said, by the entire Russian elite. The idea that Ukraine was going to be incorporated into NATO, the idea that Ukraine was going to be incorporated into the EU, the idea that you were going to promote an orange revolution and turn Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, it's unacceptable to the Russians. It was an existential threat. You might not think it was an existential threat, but what you think doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what the Russians think. And the Russians thought it was an existential threat.
Exactly. Again, like I said, like, would America allow a military power, not even just a military power, but like a great power? Would the U.S. allow China to have its military in Mexico, and Mexico join a military alliance of China? Absolutely not. And the reason why is it's a huge security risk. It's a huge security risk. If Russia was going to get into a war with the US, now you have right away on the doorstep of Russia in Ukraine, US troops, NATO troops ready for the war. That's the issue. That's the security risk that they're not going to allow to happen. And you'll see shortly, John Mearsheimer is going to tell us that, simply put, in history, in time, NATO was not even close to the doorstep of Russia initially. When it was the Soviet Union, NATO was not even close to the Soviet Union. But then when the Soviet Union fell, NATO started expanding, getting closer and closer and closer to Russia. And that's the issue. They've been lying to Russia in time, as history proves, saying we're not going to get closer to you, we're not going to incorporate other countries into our military alliance that are closer and closer to you. And they've lied, because they went ahead and did exactly that. They incorporated countries that were closer and closer and closer to Russia. They were just trying to creep up militarily with their alliance to Russia's doorstep. And that's where they are now with Ukraine, like literally the border country of Russia.
And they made it unequivocally clear to us that it was an existential threat. And how did we react? We ignored what they said, and we continued pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO, pushing to bring Ukraine into the EU, pushing to turn it into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Why did we do that? I'll tell you why we did it. Because the Russians were weak. That's what happens when you're weak in international politics. The Russians protested NATO expansion from the get-go. The first tranche took place in 1999. The second tranche of expansion took place in 2004, right? The Russians screamed bloody murder both times. We didn't care. We just shoved it down their throat. They were weak. And when they're weak, you can do that. 1999, we succeeded. 2004, we succeeded. And then in 2008, we said, we're going to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. The Russians made it very clear, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. We're going to resist. And if we have to, we'll destroy Ukraine. This was clear a long time ago. What did we do? We doubled down. We just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And what you want to understand is that from the Russian perspective, this is an existential threat. They have to win this war. They cannot afford to lose it. If you accept the argument that Putin is an imperialist and he's just bent on conquering some more territory and creating a greater Russia, and there's no really underlying security imperative, then you can cut a deal and end this war. But if you think that the Russians view this as an existential threat, you think about this conflict in very different ways. Because you're dealing with a great power that's armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons that sees itself facing an existential threat. Now, that's my view of the Russian perspective on how this has to end. They have to win. They cannot afford to lose. What is American policy and what is Ukrainian policy? American policy is we're going to beat them in Ukraine. This is, of course, Western policy. Norway is deeply involved in this. Our policy is to defeat the Russians, right? And also wreck their economy with sanctions. And also promote regime change and then put Putin on trial. And maybe even break apart Russia. This is their goal. We're going for victory. We think we can win in Ukraine. Putin has to win. We think we can win. And the Ukrainians, it's an open and shut case. Of course, from their point of view, they want to recover all their territory. And they want to weaken Russia as much as possible so that Russia can't pay a return visit. So the Russians are pursuing a clear-cut victory. The Ukrainians and the Americans or pursuing a clear-cut victory. What does this tell you? This tells you there's no diplomatic solution. There's no diplomatic solution to this one. This is why everybody basically understands that this is going to be a protracted stalemate, right? Or at least they think it's going to be a protracted stalemate. They think it's going to be a protracted stalemate because there's no solution. There's another dimension to this, the most worrisome of all, and that's nuclear escalation. Russia thinks it faces an existential threat. And
Look at where we are right now. Is Russia-Ukraine right now not a protracted stalemate? This is 3 years after, 2.5 years after this guy made these comments. That's wild.
again, what you think doesn't matter. It's what the Russians think. They think they face an existential threat. What happens if NATO succeeds? What happens if we begin to roll the Russian army back in Ukraine and we're moving up to the borders of Russia? When I say we, I'm talking about Ukrainian forces backed by NATO power. The Russians are likely to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation, right? This is a great power that's facing an existential threat, and it's losing. You don't think it's going to think seriously, at least, about using its nuclear weapons? You can rest assured it is. I like to tell the story about 1945, Japan, 1945. The Americans had defeated Japan by August 1945. Japan was defeated. We just couldn't get the Japanese to throw up their hands and surrender. And we thought that we were going to have to invade the Japanese home islands. And we knew how many casualties there had been at Okinawa and at Iwo Jima, and we did not want to invade the Japanese home islands. We were desperate to avoid invading the Japanese home islands. And you know what we did? We dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. And you know what? You could do that because the Japanese didn't have nuclear weapons of their own, and they were not going to retaliate. Well, I have news for you. The Ukrainians don't have nuclear weapons of their own. And if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Ukraine can't retaliate, and we're not going to initiate a general thermonuclear war by using nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. So you can see the potential for nuclear escalation here is real. And given the consequences, the potential of escalation does not have to be very high to scare the living bejesus out of you. Right? So you want to understand there's a perverse paradox here, which is the more successful we are in waging the war against Ukraine, the more likely it is that they'll turn to nuclear weapons. It's not to say they axiomatically will. It's just to say it becomes a real possibility. So the story I've told you here, in conclusion, is that during the Cold War, we had one conflict dyad. During the unipolar moment, we had none. During the multipolar world we now live in, there are 2 potential great power conflicts on the table. And both of them, as I tried to describe, are very dangerous. So all of you should be very fearful about the world that you live in, and even more fearful about the world that we're moving into.
Okay, guys, I think I'm gonna have to call it for now. We will do the rest for sure because the question and answer session is better, I would say, than their introduction, because now they get to go back and forth. And as well, before the question and answer session, the presenter here just asks them questions and allows them to like go back and forth themselves. So we will definitely do a part 2 for this, because it is amazing, from John Mearsheimer, and you'll see here when he goes directly with Carl and tells him like, you're incorrect on this view, I don't agree with you on this view. And notice like the way that John Mearsheimer argues, it's so polite, it's so objective, it's so just, I disagree with you on this, and this is why. And in his reasoning, he shows his argument, and he does it politely, and it wins over viewers, and not just from the argumentation style itself, but also based, of course, mainly on the objectivity. Just the argumentation style allows for the discussion to be had anyways, and you'll see again in part 2. All right, guys. I hope this was a little bit eye-opening if you weren't aware of the situation between Russia and Ukraine. Again, Allahu Alam, this is just my view. I think this is what's happening. Allahu Alam, what is the reality at the end of the day? But you can only go off of what is, we can best judge. And this is my assessment. So you'll see in part 2 a little bit more, and it'll be more in depth. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.